But as the country rounded the corner into the 20th century, things were looking up, and hope was in the air for its 220,000 residents. Besides the railway through the island's interior, a new coastal steamer service was in place, breathing new life into many previously isolated outport communities. People now had access to all kinds of goods and services, and more freedom to move about than ever before. New industries were springing up, providing employment to thousands. In 1896, iron ore mining had begun on Bell Island in Conception Bay. Almost overnight, the population there swelled from a few hundred residents to over 14,000. In 1900, sawmill operations began in Millertown and Glenwood. A huge lumber yard was established at Lewisport. And in 1904, the west coast of the island was finally free to be developed when the French traded their formal fishing rights for some British territory in northern Africa. The optimism continued when a couple of British newspaper barons set their sights on establishing a pulp and paper mill in central Newfoundland. They selected an area that had everything they needed: potential energy from the falls on the Exploits River, an ideal shipping port at nearby Botwood, and abundant stands of timber for raw pulp. So in 1905, the Anglo-Newfoundland Development Company was formed, giving rise to the town of Grand Falls. Hundreds of people found full-time work here at the mill. The new venture also provided seasonal opportunities for the thousands who still worked in the fishery. When the fishing season ended, fishermen traveled hundreds of miles, hoping to find work cutting pulpwood. Pat Mulrooney worked for years in a logging camp.
For warmth. And some of those men walked in from Trinity Bay, from all over the East Coast, and they'd have a couple of pounds of fat pork in their kit bag and 8 or 10 cakes of hard bread. And that's what they lived on. 6 to 10 and 12 days walked to Millertown because they couldn't afford the dollar to come in on the express. They never had it. So they walked.
Life in a logging camp wasn't easy. Each logger had to cut 20 cords of wood up front before he made a penny. That was to pay for his board and lodgings at the camp.
One fellow said to the old man, he said, I can't find a mattress. He said, where's the mattresses? So the old man said, the mattresses are out in the bush. You go out and pick your boughs and make your own mattress. And that's what they slept on if they stayed 6 months or 8 months or 3 months. They slept on the boughs. Then you go down in the morning, just at dark. You can imagine, you got your face down the moss for 10 and 12-hour days with a buck saw, back and forth, back and forth. It was a hard life. There was no trouble to see a crippled man in the bunkhouse. Those men couldn't straighten up, but they never gave up. They never gave up working.
The few dollars earned would be spent at the merchant's store, since there was nowhere else to spend it. He'd buy a few basic items like flour and molasses to keep his family over the winter months. As soon as spring arrived, it was back to the merchant's dealer to be outfitted for the fishery, and the cycle of debt continued. But in 1908, a man named William Ford Coker set out to change that. Born in St. John's, Coker never worked as a fisherman, but his egalitarian views led him to fight for the cause of the working class. Coker dreamed of a social revolution where, collectively, fishermen would control their own destiny, and reliance on the merchant would be no more. But organizing so many men, spread out over thousands of miles of coastline, was no easy task. Since few communities had roads or telegraph, Coker traveled all over the island by boat. Within a year, he had 30 Union branches. Coker's efforts continued, and the Fishermen's Protective Union grew. By 1911, a buying cooperative established by Coker had become the Union Trading Company. A radical newspaper united fishermen even further, and by 1914, over 200 communities had union councils. When Coker moved into the political arena as Minister of Fisheries in 1919, he'd hoped to give a powerful voice to the working class. But his attempted legislation to improve the lives of loggers and sealers was shot down. Though Coker had the support of thousands of fishermen, the power of the mercantile class could not be challenged, and his actions, though valiant and noble, scarcely had any lasting impact on the lives of fishermen. By the end of the First World War, the Newfoundland Regiment had lost over 1,300 men. Veterans, widows, and orphans were now all the responsibility of the government. The war had added millions to the country's debt, and there was great concern over Newfoundland's economic future. Meanwhile, Reed's railway venture was losing money. Newfoundland's small and scattered population could not possibly be served efficiently by such a costly operation. And in 1923, government assumed that burden as well. It was now painfully obvious that resources in the interior of the island were far less than had been anticipated, and the vast majority of the population still relied on an uncertain fishery for survival. But in the mid-1920s, new developments began to offer opportunities for steady employment. There was now interest in establishing a second paper mill in Newfoundland, on the west coast. By 1925, that mill was up and running. Then, in 1926, owners of the Grand Falls paper mill teamed up with an American company to set up a lead and zinc mine in a new town called Buchans. Still more opportunities were to be found a few years later, when fluorspar mining began at St. Lawrence on the Burin Peninsula. Newfoundlanders came from all over seeking work in the mines. Sandy Ivany's father was a miner in Buchans.
Of course, when he came here, I guess he just got used to that straight paycheck all the time. And he loved it here, and he loved the community, he loved the town.
But in the 1920s and 30s, the common practice was dry drilling, and no one knew that the dust, inhaled over the course of a number of years, would have tragic consequences.
There's a number of men contracted silicosis over the years and died of it. I often heard my father say that, and he contracted silicosis here. He worked here back in the years when they drilled dry, and he died of silicosis. But even when he was sick the last part of his life, I mean, he never had no grudge against the company. His attitude was that every day he worked, they paid him for what he agreed to work for, and he said that he couldn't ask for no more than that.
But jobs with steady pay were still quite few in Newfoundland in the 1920s, and living conditions for most were frightful. Government did what it could to provide new options for people. In 1925, a university college was established. Built as a memorial to the many young men who had died in the Great War, it offered hopes of prosperity for future generations. And the churches did their part. The Roman Catholics opened the St. Clair's Mercy Hospital, while the Salvation Army set up the Grace Hospital. But these new amenities did little to stave off the hardships that lay ahead as effects of the World Depression began to reach Newfoundland. In 1932, the Liberal government of Newfoundland had as its leader Sir Richard Anderson Squires. The public debt at that time had risen to an all-time high of $100 million. Nearly one-third of the population was on government relief. People were hungry and scared, Then a scandal occurred. Squires was accused of pocketing government funds. A desperate crowd with many questions gathered outside the House of Assembly. They wanted answers. When they got none, they rioted. Soon afterwards, the Squires' administration was replaced. The British government set up a royal commission to study Newfoundland's destitute situation and to make recommendations. But with its credit spent and its people starving, the country's choices had run out. It was decided that since Newfoundland seemed unable to handle her own economic and social affairs, she should give up her rights of self-government. So it would be, and on February 16, 1934, a British Commission government took over. Schemes of the new government did seem